Then we're going to talk about if we were to do a cross-section of each of the layers, let's see how blood flow follows with it, okay? So we know within the spinal cord, we have an anterior spinal artery and we have two posteriors. As we move into the medulla, I have two pictures of the medulla there simply because the medulla varies so much depending on what level you're looking at. So first we'll look at the bottom level. Notice that our posterior spinal, so out in this area, continues to serve the outermost portion, but that the majority of the anterior portion, as well as the more medial sections, are going to be served by the anterior spinal artery. So does everyone follow how that happened? Sort of like this became that, and that became that. Okay? As we move a little further up, now what we notice is that Ica is going to serve just this little horn here, because that's our anterior portion, and our posterior portion is going to be just this small area here. And I know it's little, but it's important to keep in mind it's kind of hard to draw that connection since we're now into the Ica area. But then the next part is basilar. So if we look back here, remember how our setup was, where we had Ica, and then here's basilar. So that's the same sort of thing that we're seeing here. Okay? So I know that that part's a little harder to keep in mind as to like how that sits in relation to things. So do people have questions about this before I move on to the next one?
Just to clarify,
yes.
The top of that picture we just looked at is the dorsal, correct? And the base is the ventral portion?
Right, so this is ventral and this is dorsal. So this is in clinical orientation, it's not in anatomic orientation, because I figured this would be easier for you guys to follow. So this is like this picture here, where you have ventral facing you and dorsal is facing away from you. Okay, so that's why the anterior is on the top. Yeah, posterior is at the back. Okay.
So he's writing the names and the anterior structures on the top.
Yeah.
As he goes down.
So then, as we move into a higher portion of the medulla, we notice that now, now as we move into the pons, everything is basilar. I know it's stupid how your book shows it as 3 different zones, but if you read what this caption says, all 3 of those zones are all supplied by the basilar artery. You don't need to separate which are the paramedian branches versus the long branches versus the short branch. They're all basilar. So just remember, it's the pontine basilar area. And the other thing to remember with that is because what's the front surface of the pons called? Anyone heard it before? Yeah, the basilar pons. That's how you remember. So that's why the pons is served by the basilar artery. Okay? Then we see that the major part of the basilar artery also continues to serve the medial ventral portion of the midbrain. And then we have 2 new players, where here the one immediately outside is going to be the quadrigeminal. And if you remember, from your diagram over here, how, I don't think I drew the quadrigeminal in, but how it sits just right after the superior cerebellar, but right before the posterior cerebral. And then finally, the thalamino-geniculate is going to be your most outer portion, and just as its name implies, it's going to be the one that actually runs through the thalamus as well, through part of the thalamus. So not all of the thalamus is supplied by thalamogeniculate, so keep that in mind. Okay, and then finally we hit into the cerebral hemispheres. And the cerebral hemispheres, I know sometimes it seems a little daunting, but it's actually very easy. It splits into 3 major zones. The first is the posterior cerebral, which will do pretty much all of the inferior portion of the cerebral hemisphere. So it's all along the bottom base of it. So that's what this set of arrows represents.
Is that the temporal area basically then?
So it's the lower half of the temporal area then.
Okay.
Because the superior half of the temporal area is largely supplied by the MCA. So the MCA basically goes up like this, and it comes out and goes in both directions. So that's why it will do the vast majority of the external cortex. Do you see how those arrows are going? Okay, and so here is the division between the PCA and the MCA. here is our division between the MCA and the ACA. And then the ACA comes up the center and then goes out towards the sides like this. And so that's why it only does this area up here. Okay? So most of your sagittal section of the cerebral cortex is going to be which type of area? What's pretty much all of this? It's the ACA. Because if it's a sagittal section, it's going to be the ACA. If it was the external section, now what's it going to be? Most of it's going to be MCA. So it would be MCA, you'd have a little bit of ACA up here, and then you'd have PCA down here. Okay, so it's like that sort of division. And then if we looked at the brain from the bottom, I apologize, I'm nowhere near as familiar with drawing this type of picture, but it would look something like this, and pretty much all of this is PCA. Okay? And that's it. So this is everything that we have for vasculature. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.